Nangpa La is a high Himalayan mountain pass which throughout history has been known as a place of passage for merchants and pilgrims traveling between Tibet at its northern end and Nepal at its southern end. The mountain pass in modern times is also a popular destination for more adventurous Himalayan trekkers, with its highest point situated at an elevation of 5,806 meters. It offers trekkers a challenging, high-altitude experience without the commitment and many of the life-threatening hazards that come along with Himalayan mountaineering. Nangpa La is also located about 2 miles from the base camp of Cho Oyu, the second most climbed 8,000-meter peak, and one of only 14 mountains in the entire world to reach such a great elevation. If you'd like to know more about Cho Oyu, check out my other video I made about it if you haven't already. Because of its location being on the border between China and Nepal and the relative ease of passage compared to the surrounding terrain, after the 1951 annexation of Tibet by China, Nangpa La has been closely monitored by Chinese troops, and in 1952, a British expedition to Cho Oyu resulted in failure, as the expedition's leader, a man named Eric Shipton, opted to set up their base camp at the Nepalese base of Nangpa La, unwilling to risk setting up their base camp in Tibet, fearing they'd be spotted and confronted by Chinese troops for being there without permission. This expedition ultimately failed, as most of the expedition's members were unable to acclimatize properly to attempt an ascent of Cho Oyu without experiencing severe altitude sickness. And while China's stance on allowing mountaineers to climb from the Chinese sides of many of the Himalayan peaks that lie on its borders would soften over time, they would continue to deploy troops to monitor passages through Nangpa La to this day. The aforementioned annexation of Tibet in 1951 took place after Tibet, which traditionally had been ruled by the Dalai Lamas, had failed to gain international recognition as a sovereign nation, and after Chinese troops had begun to take the region by force in 1950, the Chinese government approached Tibetan officials and suggested that they meet in Beijing to draft up a peace treaty, which became known as the 17-Point Agreement. Whilst in Beijing, the Tibetan officials were not allowed any communication with the Dalai Lama or any other Tibetan officials, and the 14th Dalai Lama, who is still the Dalai Lama presently, has stated that the 17-Point Agreement, with its outlined terms heavily favoring China, was drafted entirely by Chinese officials, with no input or alterations being allowed by the Tibetan officials that had been brought to Beijing to negotiate. Some of the more notable points outlined in the treaty were that Tibet would concede its independent statehood, making it an official part of the People's Republic of China, and that the Tibetan military would be absorbed by the Chinese military, and Tibet would have to cut all ties with what the Chinese government described as imperialist countries and parties, which essentially meant that Tibet could no longer accept aid or aid anyone who opposed the Chinese regime or anyone the Chinese regime deemed as a threat to their rule. In return, China would recognize Tibet as an autonomous region of China and promise to not alter the political system of Tibet, and that they would allow the Dalai Lama to continue to rule Tibet, along with the other government officials and government infrastructures, with respect to their customs and traditions, allowing for the Tibetan leadership to enact policies and reforms at their own discretion, but under the unified leadership of the Central People's Government, the administrative branch of the Chinese government. The Chinese furthermore agreed not to interfere with the Lama monasteries and local religious beliefs as part of this agreement. The agreement was signed by the Chinese and the Tibetan officials that had been sent to Beijing, with the Tibetan officials essentially being forced to sign despite not being authorized by the Tibetan government in Lhasa to do so. Despite this, the Tibetan government was essentially pressured into abiding to the terms of the agreement, as not doing so would lead to an outright invasion of Tibet by Chinese forces, a war that most Tibetan officials knew that they could not win. As the 1950s progressed, the Tibetan government continued to honor its side of the deal, but China slowly began to break its commitments to the pact, starting by redistributing Tibetan lands and enacting socialist reforms in the region. This upset many of the local people, and fears that the Chinese government would soon arrest the Dalai Lama led to unrest amongst the people, which soon led to the 1959 Tibetan uprising. The uprising began after the Dalai Lama had been scheduled to host a ceremonial dance at a Chinese government building, and fearing that the dance was a setup by the Chinese to capture the Dalai Lama, a mass of people surrounded the Dalai Lama's palace to prevent Chinese officials from reaching him. Within days, the fervor of the Tibetan people had escalated as the crowd began to chant, calling for Tibet's independence. Soon after this, the Chinese government began arresting some of the Tibetan aristocracy, executing them. Knowing that the Chinese would almost certainly target the Dalai Lama next, Tibetan forces, assisted by the CIA, began a plan to evacuate the Dalai Lama from Tibet to India before the Chinese could capture him. After several artillery shells from Chinese forces struck close to the Dalai Lama's palace, this plan was set in motion, and the Dalai Lama successfully escaped from the palace, which hadn't been closely monitored by Chinese forces, as they did not expect the Dalai Lama to flee Lhasa. The Dalai Lama has remained in exile in India since, and as the head of Tibetan Buddhism, many of his followers have followed in his footsteps, as the Chinese government has continually grown more repressive and intolerant of their beliefs and way of life over the years following the Dalai Lama's exile. On the morning of September 30th, 2006, a group of 75 Tibetan Buddhist refugees fleeing China made their way up Nangpa La Pass as part of their journey to join the Dalai Lama in India. Laboriously plodding their way through waist-deep snow, the group was approaching the border when they were spotted by Chinese troops stationed there to monitor the border. In an attempt to prevent the group of refugees from crossing the border, at approximately 10:30 a.m., the Chinese soldiers began to shoot at the unarmed refugees, striking several members of the group as they scattered and scrambled towards the border in a panic. Along with wounding several members of the group, the gunfire also fatally struck a 17-year-old girl named Kelsang Namtso. The border guards rushed towards the group of refugees to detain them, and while 41 of them were able to successfully reach the border before the Chinese troops could reach them, the remaining members of the group were not as fortunate and were captured by the Chinese troops. In the initial aftermath of the incident, Chinese officials claimed that the border guards had been acting in self-defense as justification for their actions, and had claimed that Kelsang Namtso had died not from the gunfire, but rather she had died in a Chinese hospital as a result of a lack of oxygen. But unbeknownst to the Chinese government at the time, the incident had not gone unnoticed by outside observers. Due to Nangpa La's close proximity to Cho Oyu, the pass is clearly visible from the mountaineering camps on the mountain, and several mountaineers ascending the mountain had witnessed the tragic events that had unfolded. Several mountaineers and photographers took videos and photos of the incident as it occurred, with the most damning video of the incident being captured on film by a Romanian mountaineer and cameraman named Sergiu Matai, clearly showing the Chinese troops firing their weapons at the group of refugees. And he also captured the aftermath of the violence, showing the victims of the gunfire helplessly laying in the deep snow as the troops rushed towards them. After capturing this shocking footage, Matai crossed paths with one of the refugees who had not been able to make it across the border, and helped hide him from Chinese authorities for 10 hours before assisting him in successfully crossing the border into Nepal. Matai managed to successfully smuggle the footage out of China, and upon returning to Romania on October 12th, he was interviewed by his employer, Pro TV, and the interview about the incident was broadcast alongside the footage he had captured, bringing international attention to the atrocity. On October 23rd, Chinese authorities changed their official account of the incident, finally confirming that Kelsang Namtso had indeed been killed by gunfire at Nangpa La and had not died in a hospital as they had previously stated. They, however, continued to claim that the troops had acted in self-defense, stating that the refugees had thrown stones at the guards, despite clear evidence that the troops had fired at the group from several hundred meters away, farther than anyone could possibly throw a stone. The same day as the footage was released to the public, the US ambassador to China submitted a formal human rights complaint to the Chinese government, which was unsurprisingly met with no response. On the 30th of November 2006, 16 separate NGOs issued a joint statement demanding that the UN Commissioner for Human Rights issue a statement regarding the incident, which was also met without response. Of the 33 people who were captured by the Chinese troops following the attack, 17 of them, ranging from 7 to 35 years of age, remain completely unaccounted for. Several members of the refugee group that were captured by the troops were released and managed to successfully flee China afterwards. They stated that the captured members of the group were tortured and sent to hard labor camps following their detainment, but some of them believe that several of the younger children in the group may have only been detained for a short time before being released by authorities, but whether this is true is truly unknown. Thank you all for watching.